Rural Cap Grow program. We're also co-sponsored by the Tribes Extension Program, which is an extension program out of UAF. And we are so excited to have two special guests today. We have Nick Riordan from ACAT, the Alaska Community Action on Toxics. And we have Tom Zimmer from Calypso Farm, and they're going to be talking about how to build your soil so that you can buy less of it or even buy none of it, I guess. And we're also really excited to have all of you. So it's nice to have a group here where we can talk about this. You can ask your questions, and I'm hoping that you even have some ideas to contribute. So you can, raise your hand or unmute yourself if you want to ask any questions. And I also want to note, as gardeners, we recognize that land is everything, and that we are grateful to be on native land here in Alaska. So please, in the chat, tell us where you're from, and if you know the native land that you're on, please put that as well. We are always continually striving to recognize the cultural contributions of Indigenous people from around the state, and part of that is learning to use what you have where you're located. And so we're hopefully going to take a dive into that today. So I'm going to ask, first I'll ask Nick for you to tell us a little bit more about what ACAT does, and then Tom, tell us about Calypso.
Yeah, thanks so much, Emily, and thanks for putting this on, everybody at Rural Cap and Grow program. I really have a lot of love and appreciation for what you guys have been doing. I've worked at ACAT for the last 4 years, supporting organic growers around Anchorage, often at the garden and backyard scale, a bit of churches and schools and that sort of thing as well. ACAT at large, it's an education and advocacy organization trying to promote healthy air, water, soil, and food. And so the gardening component and kind of the food component at large really ties all those things together. It's hard to make healthy food without good air, soil, and water to do it with. Would you like to hear a little more about that, or take it away, Tom?
I want to know more about what you do. So, but hi, I'm Tom Zimmer from Calypso Farm and Ecology Center. We're up in Fairbanks. Our goal is to be a catalyst to encourage more people to grow more of their own food, help people with learning about everything from seeds to soil to harvesting to eating. Because like you say, Nick, it's a big mixing pot of all these things, and you want to be able to grow healthy food and get people connected with their food and through a connection with nature. So learning ecological gardening is what we call it, where we're looking at the natural systems and then trying to mimic that to produce healthy food.
Awesome. Go ahead.
I was just going to say we're looking into year 23 here in Fairbanks. Soil building has been and will be a major part of our farm, and it's a slow process. It's a fun process, and there's always more to learn and understand. So I think Nick and I may have ideas, suggestions, but I certainly don't know all the answers, but that's part of the fun, is always learning, always moving ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, I still have my Calypso Farm teacher's guide that's almost 25 years old now. I haven't thrown it away. It's awesome. It's an awesome resource. So you guys have come a long way, and it's really great to see you grow and do so many different things, not just in Fairbanks, but throughout the state. So I'm going to start with a question about, imagine you're in rural Alaska, and of course this would apply, even in Anchorage or Juneau or in a city, but, and you don't want to buy dirt. What are some things that you can do to get started on building your soil? And how about Nick, why don't you go first, and then we'll hear from Tom.
Yeah, I think in the theme of, well, there's two components when I think of soil. I think of the pieces that are rock, sand, silts, and clays, broken down rock, the mineral component, and then there's often an organic component, both dead organic material and then living organic material, the microbiology and stuff in there. So you can, I'd say a good place to start though would be looking at what other people are up to in your area. Man, if you have a mentor or someone who's succeeded at all in your community, in your neighborhood, or somewhere even with similar circumstances, having to recreate the wheel is a lot of work. So that can be really helpful. Soil, because of the mineral component, soil can really weigh a lot, so moving it around is a huge burden. So I think sourcing locally where possible is going to be huge. Occasionally I get phone calls from people with topsoil, and I think a lot of that is coming from construction, you know, or people are landscaping, people are doing like setting up a site to build a home on, and so they don't want that soil anymore, and so that's an opportunity. I see it as an opportunity certainly to get large volumes of it may have been just cleared forest and they're scraping it off, and yeah, that's really valuable to somebody who does want it then for their project. How about you, Tom?
All right. Well, I would say the first thing to do is look around you and see what the natural system is. Every place has different soils, like Nick is saying. Is it sandy, silty, clay, whatnot? So look around and see how the native plants are growing. Now, we are manipulating plants that have been domesticated that may not like the same soils as those native plants, but we're looking at cycling of nutrients. We're looking at building a soil. And again, it's super important to realize you can't build a decent soil in 1 year. You can start a garden and you can grow, but this is a multi-year process. So thinking about what materials you can access for composting. Composting is just our human, or I should say hot composting is the way that we can speed up decomposition. If you look in the forest, it's slow decomposition. There's a natural cycle, there's a balance in there. And we are needing to build up our garden soil. So we're going to be out of balance to begin with. And we got to realize and understand that it's going to take some time for us to build that soil up. And why are we building this soil? What are we trying to grow? What other parameters are limiting? Soil holds nutrients. Soil holds the microbial part. But it also is really important for water holding capacity. Our farm is on a hillside. We do not have a well. We catch water from fall rain. And so that's really important to have that water. But even as important is to have a soil that, if you will, is a sponge that can hold that moisture. So step back and think of soil as nutrients, as particles, as water holding. It's a really complex and really fun system, and it's going to take some time to get there. So start small, look around you, see what resources you have, and start composting and start experimenting.
So I'm glad you mentioned composting, especially, and also that, you know, this idea that hot composting is not necessarily what we see in nature. You know, like nature is doing cold composting over a long period of time. So we're doing hot composting to speed up the process. However, you know, that can be hard in rural villages where animals are around. So what are your tips for that? So maybe Tom first, and then Nick. How do you start a composting pile, especially if you're in a place with bears and things?
No, that is a great question. So, for example, one of the projects we're working with the folks in Igiagig. Igiagig's at the end of the long lake there. Sandy soils, not a lot of, you know, it's tundra with willow and some spruce coming in. So what are their nutrient sources that they can recycle there? Well, one of the things that they have access to is a lot of kitchen scraps from the fishing lodges. So there's fish guts, there's kitchen waste, and we're talking 40 buckets, 5-gallon buckets a week sometimes that they're getting of kitchen scraps. And that is also possibly a bear attractant, because there's uncooked meat in there. There's all kinds of wonderful smells coming out of those buckets. But in those buckets, it's fermenting, right? It's molding and fermenting, and we're losing some of those nutrients. So how does Jeff take that material, turn it into good compost, good soil, in a timely manner and without attracting bears? So that's what we're trying to work on. One of the big things he needs there is some carbon source. So he's cutting grasses on the side of the roadside, collecting leaves, trying to figure out how do you get that right carbon to nitrogen ratio? Now, if he has all the carbon he needs and he's got all this lodge waste, we could get a pile going in no time. And just in a short term, that hot compost is going to get down past bear attractant. But you got to get to that point, right? So you've got to find your mixes, you've got to grab your materials. He is using an electric fence around the garbage spot, but still it's an attractant. They may not get into your compost, but they may still be coming into the village, which causes problems. So I'm not giving you a full answer there because it's something we're working on and need to figure out. But if you can get it into a hot compost pile, it should in a short time get churned up and get heated up by those microbes and be less of an attractant. Nick, what are your secrets?
I really appreciate your points, Tom. Those are good. And it's an issue that's, we're facing all over the place. Certain things aren't attractants in my experience. I mean, we're trying to make compost here, and a lot of animals aren't that interested in dirt. And there's especially in the summertime, there's vegetables all over the place. So if we're composting things that are basically vegetables, yard waste and that sort of stuff, it's not that big of a deal. But when you start to put in human food, or like you said, butchery waste, fishery waste, that's going to require some management. And this, you can protect it. You can make a little prison like we do, for moose in Anchorage. People erect these huge chain link fences so you can never get out. But like you said, Tom, mixing it down, getting it hot composting, speeding up the process is really helpful. And so the window of time when it might be an attractant is diminished. I think that really helps. I attracted some animals this last winter. I was composting a lot of food waste from Providence Hospital, one of our larger hospitals in Anchorage, and I had snowy owls as well as I think a weasel, some sort of weasel living or adjacent to my winter composting project for the months of December and January and into February. And so I think I had a little bit, of an explosion of a mouse population. This is all speculation. I saw the owls, I saw the weasel. I assume the mice were there too. But it tapered off, and there's concern around, not just the big critters like attracting a moose or a bear, but the small critters when you have voles or mice or something, and the damage those can wreak on your perennials, nibbling bark at the soil level underneath the snow, kind of out of sight, out of mind. And so I think it is a concern, but I didn't have any damage to my perennials this year. I like to think, a healthy ecosystem provides support for lots of things. And I think in this situation, maybe I was lucky, but maybe, these critters kind of stepped in and took over that abundance a bit.
Nice. Well, that's kind of a relief to hear. And obviously if there's, if folks have questions about specific animals or things like that, please put them in the chat. So, I'm hearing composting is really, it's the benefits are really worth it. And the animal attractant issue is maybe not such a big deal that you might think it is.
Well, so, Emily, it definitely in certain places like Tyonek and Igiaga, the bear issue is a real concern that you do want to look at. So I would say with everything in our gardening mantras, we talk about diversity. We talk about starting small. Don't bite off too much too fast. You may dream of a huge garden, but let's build slowly. Same with the composting. Let's try some smaller composting operations to figure out our techniques before we get into large scale of anything. Nature likes that diversity, likes lots of, we've got to look at our microclimates. We've got to look at, like, where do you put your compost? One thing you could try is composting in situ, where this is going to be a future garden bed, but right now it's not. Let's dig it up and let's put some of that material in there and go with a slower decomposition. But if it's fenced in, then we might be safe from bears. So like I said, we don't know all the answers. We are always experimenting, and what works for a farm, for our farm, and what works for a farm 10 miles away are different things. So experiment. And that's what I love about these Zooms, is we're trying to build a community and trying to learn from each other's pros and cons. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, that actually, it makes me think of, well, first of all, lasagna gardening, which is its, own thing. But burying fish waste does seem to be really effective. I mean, I tried it once with hooligan heads that, and I didn't have, I thought, oh, all these animals are going to find it. And that didn't happen. I'm curious, does anybody else have some experience with burying fish waste? And was that successful or not, I guess?
Someone told me that if they had the experience of burying fish waste, and the bears came in and tilled the soil for them. So they were talking about free tillage. I don't know that's exactly what we want, but I'll let other people jump in.
By July, I usually have some active compost piles, like they're already hot. And so my approach, if I get salmon carcasses from friends or from my brother or something, I put them right into a hot compost pile and I bury them deep. But that's trying to be cautious, essentially. Yeah. And burying them in the soil. I used to bury all my kitchen scraps in the soil before I knew even what composting was. My veggie gardens, I would just, along the paths, that's the only method of composting I had. Dig a little hole, drop in the bucket, bury it, and never see it again.
Sounds perfect. So my next question might be a little controversial. And that is about soil testing. So like if we're building all these compost piles and, or we're incorporating, compost into our soil, or even just lasagna gardening with raw food waste, do we need to test the soil? And, if you've got a small garden plot, how important is it? Who wants to go first?
Oh, Nick, you could go, or I can. I don't find that controversial. I got lots of answers for you.
Yeah, go for it, Tom.
Okay. So soil testing. We're talking the science part of looking at your soil. And remember, when you take that sample, it is sent to a lab and it is analyzed in a certain lab setting. And the results you get back are a bunch of numbers. Now, really, if you're going to, in my opinion, if you're going to soil sample, you want to sample every year and you want to be able to compare those numbers. If it gives you an exact number of 1,500 units, that's not so much what we're looking at or what we're wanting to look at. We want to see over time as we build soil, how that number fluctuates. The exact number is not the important thing. It's the fluctuation of that number. But soil tests take money. You do have to have a good sampling system. It's got to be somewhat random across your garden, but you also have to have an understanding of your garden setting. If you have different soils in different parts of your garden, you're going to want to sample differently. So it can get kind of complex, but there's another way of sampling soil, and that is observation of how your plants are growing. I've got broccoli growing, it's growing nice and healthily, the leaves are good dark green, but I've got some in the hollow heart, in the stem of the broccoli. There's a little bit of this separation. What's causing that? So you can use your plants and your observations as soil tests too. It doesn't have to be a laboratory test. And there's lots of, if it's green around the veining, or it's yellow around the veins, or it's purpling, or this, there's a lot of plant visuals that can help you learn about your soils.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Tom, for sure. That's what we end up, because we often are working in people's backyards, smaller little gardens. We don't often end up doing soil tests, like, again, the year-to-year comparison of those numbers and determining trends. But we do a lot of kind of low cost, call them bioassays sometimes, but it's observation, like Tom said. And so some of that's simply a germination test, see which seeds germinate and which types. You know, is it grasses or is it broadleaf plants that can germinate? We might look, yeah, like you said, if leaves are curling, if stems are twisted. There's certain sorts of contaminants that, again, my background, my working at ACAT, persistent herbicides, we have sources of organic matter that we may compost and add to add a little fertility to these gardens. And some of those can bring things that we want, and some of them can bring things that we don't want. And so some of our soil testing is to identify that before these composts or these materials get distributed. And so, yeah, watching how plants grow, these different colors, the different morphologies that they have is really helpful. I would add that, yeah, even simply putting a soil into a jar and adding water and giving it a good shake and watching it settle out, because you got to start somewhere, and the observation is the key. And so you can observe with just your eyes and start there, and then you can add a soil test to that and get numbers on a page. And I think all of those are useful, but there's ones that you can go out and do as long as your soil is thawed. And there's other ones that you're going to have to wait a couple weeks for it to get it back in the mail. And so, yeah, as many as you need. If you're having lots of problems, I think, you employ all the tools. Contact a cooperative extension agent to help guide you in terms of what those numbers mean and how to proceed. There's lots of resources out there, and soil tests are a good one of them.
Thanks, Nick. Maybe it's just like getting confirmation that being a bit of a lazy gardener is okay. And part of it is just confusion. It's like, okay, my soil on this half of the yard is different than soil on the other half of the yard. How am I supposed to test it? But you did remind me that like a pH test is easy. And that is something, you can do with a jar of soil and some water, and, at least know what your pH is, because that's something that is not necessarily quickly adjusted, but at least you'll know if it's good for plants, and that's an easy one to do.
I'm glad you brought up pH, because I think that is one of the most important numbers that we can have, because in a lot of natural systems, the plants and the microorganisms that work with the plants can handle those acid soils. But then we are growing these domesticated annuals that are a little more fragile, if you will, or particular about where they are. And there's a lot of relationship between your soil pH, the microorganisms in that soil, and then the nutrients that those plants need. So, for example, phosphorus will lock up in acid soils. It locks up in alkaline soils. It locks up when you have cold soils. It is a very fickle nutrient. So we want to keep that pH closer to the neutral zone for our annuals. So we really have to look at, what are we growing? Are we growing fruit trees? Are we growing native plants? Are we growing these veggies? And trying to work with that. And pH is a nice, simple colorimetric test that we can do. It's not expensive. You can do it yourself. And it gives you an idea that oh gosh, I'm at 5. Our native soil is 5.4, and potatoes will grow all right in that. But it, as we have pushed our pH, brought it up closer to neutral, our vegetables are growing a lot better, and everything is going along much better. But like you also mentioned there, is you don't want to go from 5.4 to 6.8 in 1 year. It's balanced, it's building, and it's working with the life in the soil. If you just jump rapidly, you are doing temporary damage, and it takes longer to get to balance again.
Awesome. So let's talk about soil amendments around the state. What are some of your favorite things that people can collect locally that they can, either put directly in their gardens or add to a compost pile? And Darren from Juneau is talking about seaweed. So maybe Darren, you can unmute if you want to tell us about that, because seaweed's an awesome one if you live on the coast.
Happy to. I'll try not to be too wordy here, since I'm not on the spotlight. Thank you, Tom and Nicholas. It's great to hear you. And hello. And I saw Susan sneak in there, Tom. So hello to Susan too. It's been so many years. Hi. Yes, we are blessed with seaweed along our coasts here in Alaska, and it's always we're never picking the seaweed that is growing. We want the stuff that just washes up naturally on the beaches. It always comes with a whole host of other organisms, which we are sacrificing for our gardens, for the good of our gardens. But so there's a lot of proteins and therefore nitrogen that's coming in at the same time, and a lot of shells with the calcium and phosphorus that comes in, granted slowly released. But the seaweed itself is providing awesome organic matter and good potassium, and of course the huge array of micronutrients. And so as far as soil building, it's just part of that kind of the triad of magic that we try and get the peat when it's available, where we can find it from our forest areas, and then mix it with some sand, mix it with some seaweed, and then that's kind of a kickoff for us here in Southeast Alaska and coastal Alaskan environments. It's also, just as I was mentioning in there, that it's just an excellent additive to your composts as well. You can also make teas out of it, put it in a bucket and add water. You can bubble it or not, but when you pour that on your soil, it just feeds all those microbes, and they love it. I don't know what else to say about it. Oh yeah, and then
I have a question, Darren.
Yeah.
I've heard two camps. Some people say you have to rinse the seaweed, and some people say you don't.
Right.
Tell me, what's the...
I've never heard of anybody who's doing outdoor growing have any concern with salts, whether they're rinsing it or not. Granted, I'm in this rainforest, and so finding unrinsed seaweed would be more of a trick than finding rinsed seaweed, than having to rinse it yourself. So the only time that we have trouble with the salts is in the controlled environments, when we have our high tunnels and that kind of thing. Same thing that you have trouble with if you use a lot of manures in a high tunnel. But you can always saturate it with water and leach them out. But otherwise, nope, not a problem. And I'm going to start a rumor here, if I may. I was just talking with, and she's the person who I was talking to here, Jen and her husband, Larry Landry and Gustavus, Stellar Botanicals, wonderful folks. But she's working with Jennifer McBeath, our plant pathologist at UAF, on some issues that she's had with, that she knows powdery scab with her potatoes. And she noticed that the bed that she had built this giant seaweed pile compost on top of, and then ended up, and I'm not sure how much time transpired between this, but she's seen a lot of residual seaweed in that bed. But she planted out her potatoes in there, and it was supposed to be a control bed in the research, but those ones came out with almost zero scab. So this is the beginning of the rumor that maybe that real huge bolus of seaweed in that environment may have contributed to keeping the scab down.
Awesome. That's great. Well, you heard it here first. Okay, so the question on the table is your favorite amendments from around the state. So Nick, you want to go?
Yeah, I'm here in Anchorage, and there are a lot of humans, and there are actually a lot of horses, and to a lesser degree goats and chickens, but a lot of humans. So there happens to be a lot of food waste in our environment, and a lot of manures from those animals, and a lot of yard waste from the many city lots that are getting maintained. And even the trees that get taken down, you end up with a lot of wood chips. So it's hard to pick a favorite, but if anything, I'd emphasize in this setting, there is an overabundance of these kinds of organic materials that can be sometimes composted, sometimes hot or cold, but aged and used as soil amendments. Even the cardboard from the amount of stuff that gets shipped up here. A friend, kind of a garden mentor, recently mentioned to me that from cardboard, our soils are often deficient in boron, but boron is an additive in the adhesives in cardboard, and so there's sometimes there's nice little silver linings, but there's an abundance of materials. Manure, if I had to pick one, I do use manure a lot. I like weeding, and so maybe for some people the weed seeds that you might get there, I like hot composting, I like weeding, but it's pre-chewed, it's been mixed up. Having animals contribute to the process I find really nice. So feeding things to chickens and having horses already and cows already sort of half compost the material for me speeds it up. How about you, Tom?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. My mantra always is diversity. So I don't like just one thing. We use horse manure because we don't have cows around, but Fairbanks has horses, so we do get horse manure in. We have animals as part of our farm, and they are an important part of the farm so that they are our nutrient cyclers. So we have 3 acres of vegetables, and then we're bringing in hay for the animals. All of that bedding and manure goes into compost. And then in the summer, they are wandering around the farm, nibbling and bringing those nutrients in. Because when you are doing production, you are taking nutrients off the farm. It's not a closed system, right? So we have to bring something in. The main amendment we use is fish bone meal that comes from Alaska Sea Ag. It's a waste product, could be a pollution problem, but it's a wonderful source for calcium and phosphorus with some nitrogen in there. But diversity is really, really key. And then in Fairbanks, we have a lot of coffee shops. And logistically, it's a pain in the butt, but coffee grounds are a wonderful nitrogen source. They're easy to work with. And Steve Masterman, who runs a apple orchard up here in Fairbanks, he is researching if coffee grounds aren't a repellent and or even somewhat toxic to voles. So he's putting coffee grounds around his trees. One is a nutrient. It'll sheet compost in the system, but 2 is a repellent. So anytime you're working in the garden, whether you're growing in a pot or growing on a raised bed or in a big field, you want to get the most out of your action. So if you can get multiple features out of a practice, then that's great. So the coffee grounds would be nutrients, repellent, and who knows what else. So think diversity, experiment, and then also think about the holistic of the whole garden. Is we don't want a monocrop. We want to have that diversity of other things, and that segues us into cover cropping.
Awesome. I see that question from Erica, and I was going to say coffee, though it does not grow here, of course, is definitely universally available in Alaska. So like we should all be collecting coffee grounds. Yeah, so Erica Erica's asking, what's your favorite cover crop and do they even work in Alaska?
Nick, have you cover cropped much?
No, that's not something I use mulch extensively, and I've planted things a bit late. I don't know if that counts.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple terms that get thrown out there: cover cropping, green manures. But green manures are technically something that you plant that you are going to turn back into the soil or return everything there. Cover cropping technically is planted during your fallow season when you're not growing a production crop. So in Fairbanks, we don't really have a fallow season where we're like growing veggies in the summer and then planting a cover crop for the winter. So cover cropping, green manuring, it's all part of the cycle. Some years we need to rest part of the garden and put a cover crop in there. Cover cropping is about growing material to be turned back into the soil, covering that soil. But it's more than just that. You've got to think not just about the above ground part of that plant, but the rooting system of that plant. So again, you don't want to just have a monocrop of a cover crop. You want to have a mix of things. So annual rye is great. It has miles of fine roots that help build soil structure. Peas are great. What do we use? Winter peas. Those are considered a giver, so they're associated with microorganisms that fix nitrogen. Buckwheat can be great if you want good succulent material, but you need to make sure you kill that buckwheat before it goes to flower. As it goes to flower, it goes from juicy green to a thicker stalk, which is harder to break down. And then if it actually goes to seed, can become a weed problem. So oats, what are some other ones, Susan?
Field peas.
Yeah, field peas, oats,
Annual rye.
buckwheat, Phacelia can be used as a cover crop. That's also called bee balm. It's great for bringing in insects. So think of a complex system when you cover crop.
Clovers are nice.
Yeah, clovers, but
Annual.
remember you want to do annual clovers, not the sweet clovers. Those are considered invasive. So, and are you cover cropping in a tilled system, or how are you managing your cover crop? We manage it by either mowing it down with a weed whacker or putting the animals through. The idea is that you're building up material in the soil and building soil aggregates. So we are trying to do little to no tilling, because tilling then just breaks all that aggregate up again. So you've got to come up with a way that works for your garden to break it down. And if you mow it down in the fall or crimp it, crimping is a term where you roll it and basically instead of it standing up and desiccating, you knock it down so the microorganisms can get to it. Then over the winter, those microorganisms, they can still be active. They're not going to be highly active, but they still can break things down for you and get it into your soil. So
Also, late planting and winter kill.
late planting and winter killing, yes, is another thing. If you have that, but again, you want to make sure that when it kills, it's down on the ground. Try to minimize tilling, try to maximize diversity.
Nick, did you answer that one already?
I don't have experience in the cover cropping and specifically. Often in the kind of like end of the season, I will add compostables to a bed and let it sit through the fall, through the winter, and then be there in the spring. And it often looks quite different. To Tom's point, I think the microbes remain active far longer than I do in the winter. So.
And I know Erica's in the banana belt of Alaska, so it's possible you have a little bit more time to do a fall cover crop. And the Alaska Plant Materials Center is a great place to call, and they have given out cover crop seeds before, if you are interested. Before I forget, I want to go back to Anne's question, and Anne is in Girdwood. So, I hope I understand this. So you were asking about talking back when we were talking about, how observing our plants. And if I understand your question correctly, like you're saying that certain plants just don't like the soil. Correct me if I'm wrong. Like, what if a brassica just won't grow, and what can you do about that? Is that am I getting your question right? So I don't know if Anne, if you can unmute yourself, but I guess the question is, what do you do if plants don't grow in the soil? What would you like? I guess what process would you take? Like, you have some dirt, you've got dirt, nothing grew there. What would you do?
I would start with looking at the whole situation. Is it a sunny spot? Is it a good warm spot? Digging down in the soil and feeling, does it have what we call tilth? Is it hard packed and poor tilth, or does it have other things that are getting in the way? Also, the trees, I think this is partly what Anne is saying, is, are the trees inhibiting it? Yes, birch trees can be allelopathic, where they push out chemicals into the soil that limit other plants growing. So yeah, you may need to remove those trees or move your garden away from the site there. But yeah, I mean, this is the exciting part about gardening, is it's a puzzle, and something grows well over here but not over here. Is it the soil? Is it the water? Is it other plants competing? So taking those problems and turning them into a fun puzzle, that's the great part of this.
Here.
Thanks. I'll move on to Jamie's question, which was about chicken manure. So apparently she attended a talk recently where Steve Brown said you don't need to have chicken manure cooled down. What are like the dangers and benefits of using manures? How about Nick, you go first.
Yeah, most of my experience is with horse manure, and I think of the primary dangers is it's just weed seeds, and maybe potentially you have so much of it that you have a lack of variety. Like Tom said, variety is a great approach when you're composting. But then also the fact that if you have animals that are eating primarily grasses, and those grasses are grown at an agricultural scale, that persistent herbicides are used to kill broadleaf plants. So then when you're dealing with that manure, those herbicides have been shown, they don't break down completely. Maybe 30% of it might get destroyed in the gut of the animal, and then you're left with that in the manure, but you then concentrate it in the compost pile. So composting is another way to break it down, hot composting in particular. So and then some soil microbes can further break it down, but it's a risk all the way through the chain. And as you're concentrating things, you really need to have things in place that are breaking it down. Otherwise you just end up with more and more of these, and we're often growing these broadleaf plants. If you're growing grasses, manure is on a lawn. In that sense, it's no longer a concern. Those broadleaf herbicides, actually, if you don't like dandelions, you're in heaven. As far as chicken manure, I've been mixing it into compost piles, and so I've been giving it kind of another cycle before using it. So I don't have experience of trying to use it straight, but I've found that it is a great addition to a compost pile. And yeah, as a green, and the end product has been, the plants seem happy. So
chicken manure is what we call a hot manure. Because chickens don't urinate and defecate, it all comes out as one thing, and it's very high in nitrogen. And you can burn plants with it. So my mantra is always composting everything, because the microbes are making things more plant available. So something may have these nutrients in, but are they actually plant available? What type of nitrogen does your plant need? certain perennials like ammonias, and certain of our annual crops like nitrates. And so we've got to think about the form of the nitrogen. So let the microorganisms do that work for you. Again, if you plop out a bunch of chicken manure out on a garden site and look to see what grows there, nothing grows right there because it's too hot. So composting, mixing it up, getting the microbial part going is so, so important. Now, back when Susie and I first were moved to Fairbanks, we did what we called hot boxes. And we lived in the black spruce permafrost, and we tried to grow a garden. And what we did is we took boxes, wooden boxes, and they were probably 8 to 12 inches deep. I don't know if my hands are doing any good for visually there. But underneath the boxes, we put 2 spruce logs. So they probably 4 or 5 inches just to hold the box up. And then we put raw chicken manure. Well, it was chicken manure and bedding. So it was some wood chips and chicken manure. And then we put the box on, and we filled the box with soil. And we grew into that soil. And the idea was that that hot chicken manure underneath was actually decomposing, was composting, and was warming our soils. So we were taking that heat from that compost and helping our soils. And then the other idea is that the vegetables growing in that box, they could grow where they wanted to. And if they grew down and it was too hot for them, they stopped and grew in another direction. So you certainly don't want to just put a lot of chicken manure on and then plant your plants in there, because they don't have the room to move away from those hot spots. Hopefully that made sense. But a hot box is basically each year you have to redo it. You got to redo the compost underneath. So it's a lot of work, but we grew some pretty darn good vegetables there, didn't we? Yes. So there's some ideas, but if you can, compost it. Rabbit manure is considered safe to use directly, and a lot of tree orchardists will put raw rabbit manure right around the trees because it has been broken down numerous times. You certainly could do that. I still like to put everything through the compost pile because Mother Nature knows a hell of a lot more than I do.
And Jamie, I would add that, the pathogen issues, the dangers of chicken manure, it's not worth it. If you had an experiment maybe, but you really want to compost it or like Tom said, bury it beneath, at the bottom of your garden bed so that it's safe. It's just, the vectors for disease are just too great. I wouldn't do that. But if you got a place to experiment, you could try it out. But that actually brings me, Nick, do you have another point?
I was just going to chime in. We talked about low cost tests, and for compost, one that's again easy is to put, you think your compost is finished, ? Is it? Put it in a Ziploc bag, seal it, put it away in your, leave it there for a week inside your house, open it up. How's it smell? How's that for low cost? Anyway, if it hasn't broken down all the way, it's going to smell, it's going to stink. And if it doesn't stink, you're well on your way to a good finished compost.
And thank you, because that actually segues into my next question about finished compost versus unfinished compost. Because, if you're doing lasagna style or, you just have a bunch of soil amendments you've piled up and you can plant right in there. How does that work? Why do you not need finished compost to grow things? What can you tell me more about that? I've always been curious.
In my experience, about the best garden beds I've had with the lasagna or sheet mulch style, where you're layering different kinds of organic material, often kind of a green or brown, high nitrogen or high carbon layers alternating, that the ones I built in the fall and let sit through the summer, or sorry, sit through the winter and then plant in the spring have the greatest success. They're the easiest for me to work with. They're often full of worms, which is just, sort of a worm census is a nice indicator of a nice stack of microorganisms that are supporting those larger soil creatures. Yeah, and I think when people build them in my experience, building them and trying to plant them in rapid fire usually requires, in my experience, it always requires like some degree of bringing in a finished compost soil mix to put on top, and you're sort of trying to time it so the seedling is inhabiting that layer as the stuff underneath is breaking down. So. I like to time if you have some time on your hands, a lot of these things are a lot more enjoyable and successful for you to make observations and to enjoy the process as it's happening. And so letting the composting process take place is probably your best bet.
Emily, if I can add to that, because I 100% agree with what Nick's saying there, is when we hot compost, that's a bacterial decomposition. And if you can let your pile sit and mellow, if you will, you get more decomposition going on because the bacteria are going to hit certain things, the easy sugars, the easy carbon breakdown. And then it's too hot for those organisms in there, or like the worms, your macroorganisms. So once your hot compost has broken down and you do that Ziploc test that Nick mentioned, which is great test, you do a hand test, you grab in and you look at the compost, and you don't want to be able to identify what you put in there. So once that's all done, you can let that pile sit and mellow, and that's when your worms will move in and finish up the jobs. That's when the fungal action can happen, where it can break down more of the hard carbon bonds. So time, like I said at the beginning, building soil takes time, and we don't want to rush it. Sure, we need to get it done right now for this year's garden, but in the long run, we're talking about garden production 2, 3 years, 4, 5, 10 years down the road. So be easy on yourself, use what you have, and know that you can always do better. You can always do little things that will make it a little bit better, and time is very important. If you have leaf litter, I don't put leaves into the compost pile because I get, they tend to mat down on me and make a really carbon-rich zone. So I do a leaf litter compost, which I know is going to take a long time. And I basically take a large piece of fencing, maybe a diameter of, let's say 3 feet and maybe 4 or 5 feet high. And I rake up leaves and I throw the leaves in there. And every year I just keep adding leaves to the top. And after a couple of years, you go to the bottom and you pull out that leaf mulch, and you can see all the fungal breakdown. You can see the macroorganisms that are in there nibbling it down. It's a very different material, but it's really good, and it's a different way of breaking down these leaves. And then you can put that in with your potatoes. When you're hilling your potatoes, put it into your potatoes down the bottom. Once they come up, throw some of that leaf mulch, throw some soil, and then you're building your soil up with fungal attributes as well. So again, diversity. Don't just get stuck with one way. I mean, like I said, we've been doing this for 20 some odd years, and I'm still learning. I'm still beginning to understand other things that I'm completely missed out on. And that's exciting to be like, let's try this. Let's incorporate that. I
like that. And I think it's a very Alaskan, cultural theme, which is always getting ready. You're always preparing for next year. So it's like, and I think as a gardener, that's one of the things I try to, share with beginning gardeners. It's like, right now in May of 2023, we're getting ready for next year, so you're making that pile and you're, thinking ahead to delicious vegetables in years to come. So I think that's, the themes I'm hearing is time, diversity, and, patience, looking around you, seeing what you can use, being creative. So it's a lot. So I think I was about to say there's no other questions, and you made it in a deadline. Have you ever thought about designing your gardens using the amendments in an artistic way? Well, and you should see some pictures of Nick's garden. And if you Google the Spenard Community Garden in Anchorage, you will see beautiful beds that he has made. Do you guys, Tom, do you have art in the garden with your soil amendment?
No. No. The art that we have in the garden is our plants. So against that monoculture aspect, we have flowers, we companion plants, we mix things together. Yes, we are a production farm, so we don't want broccoli scattered everywhere, but we do little blocks of broccoli. We have lots of flowers in among the broccoli, and the flowers may be picked themselves or they may be left. But that diversity, that is our art. And then our pathways, we do not till our pathways. We have living pathways. So we use a broad fork to turn our soils or to loosen our soils. We don't even want to flip and turn them. And so that is our jungle out there. What was your point?
Oh, habitat for.
Yeah, habitat. We're trying to build habitat because we are ecologically gardening as best we can. We're trying to mimic natural cycles. There's interesting little thing about flowers. If you need to have a nectar source scattered throughout your garden, if you don't have nectar in your garden, you don't have adult predators. And then when you get a pest, the pest has no control. So having that nectar source around the garden, and someone threw out the term the number 60 feet, you have to have a nectar source every 60 feet so that you have a good predator population. Scatter those flowers out there. As far as how we do the amendments, I want to build a healthy soil, and then the plants can take what they want, because a broccoli takes differently than a poppy, than a lettuce or anything. So instead of building a soil for broccoli or a soil for this, we build the healthiest soil we can for water holding, nutrients, microorganisms, and then let the plants take what they need.
Sounds perfect. Well, thank you everybody for coming today, and let us know if you have any feedback for us. If you have any further questions, we'll be happy to try to get those questions answered. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye,
Thank you
folks.
for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.